Hello everybody, this is the first lesson of the lecture Macroeconomics. I will discuss slide 1 to 33 of the first chapter, Introduction to Macroeconomics. Before we start, let me give you an overview about the topics of this first chapter. The first section deals with the question what is macroeconomics, especially with regard to microeconomics, of course. Then I will introduce a quite basic model, macroeconomic model, the so-called circular flow model. As we will see, this model is a kind of theoretic backbone that appears in all other macroeconomic models. So it's quite useful. At the same time, it helps to organize the macroeconomic data, something we call national accounting. And that's what we will discuss in the third section of this chapter. Here I will introduce to you the concept of gross domestic product, GDP, and we will see what different components GDP has. So we start with the definition, then I develop three different ways that we can use to calculate GDP that give us also different insights into the economies, into the macroeconomic activities in an economy. In the following section we will discuss the difference between nominal and real GDP. We will see nominal GDP is blown up by inflation, so we will develop a possibility to get rid of the impact of inflation, and then we will calculate real GDP. At the same time, the difference of nominal and real GDP helps us to calculate an indicator of the average price level in an economy, so-called GDP deflator. The GDP deflator can then be used to calculate the inflation rate of an economy. In the next section we will discuss how we get from GDP to disposable income of households. Disposable income of households is the money households hold in their pockets by the end of the day. So that is the money they can spend, and therefore private companies are often interested about the disposable income of an economy, because that's the money people can spend to buy their goods and services. By the end of this chapter, we will discuss the question whether GDP can be used to measure the welfare the people living in an economy. GDP is not defined to measure welfare, but as we will see, it is correlated with a couple of numbers that should also be correlated with the welfare of the households or people living in an economy. At the end of this chapter, you find a couple of questions for review. You can use these questions to control your learning success. Most of these questions can be easily answered if you look up the special slides in the lecture notes. If you're not sure whether you have answered such a question in a correct way, you can always send me an email, or you can visit my online colloquium. If you want to visit my online colloquium, you need a software called AlphaView. In the syllabus of this lecture you find information how to download the software. The software is for free, and you find also the link to my online colloquium in the syllabus. Okay, so let's start with the first section. What is macroeconomics? Well, very basic question. Let's start with microeconomics. Microeconomics typically studies the behavior of individual households and firms cooperating over markets. So single firms, single households, and single markets are the main subjects of microeconomics. To the contrary, in macroeconomics, we study the economy as a whole, that is, the sum of individual behavior of households and firms. So we have now not single households and single firms, but we have the so-called firm sector or company sector, where we add up the production or the sales or value added of all firms together. The same way we deal with the household sector. Here we add up the demand, the income, the labor supplied, the savings supplied of all households together. So we deal in macroeconomics not with single economic agent, but with aggregates. As we will see, this is necessary because the macroeconomic whole is very often more than the sum of its microeconomic parts. A quite well-known example why this is the case is the so-called savings paradoxon. The savings paradoxon is one example that shows us that we would not get the correct macroeconomic results if we simply add up the microeconomic results. Let me show you how the savings paradoxon happens. First, let's start with individual household. So let's start with the microeconomic perspective. For an individual household, also a company of course, it is always possible to increase savings by reducing expenditure. Since individual income stays constant, if the household reduces expenditure, savings will grow. It's easy to see this if we write down the budget constraint of a household. Budget constraint of a household says that household income is always equal to household expenditures plus savings. It says, in other words, every part of income which is not spent is automatically saved. Of course, if we spend more than we have income, then savings will get negative and we will run into debt. Okay, let's deal with this equation. We can rewrite this equation such that savings stands on the left side, and on the other side of the equation we have income minus expenditure. So this way the equation says every part of income which is not spent is saved. Now it's easy to see that if we reduce our expenditures and income stays constant, that automatically our savings get larger. So for an individual household, it is always possible to increase savings by reducing expenditure. Should be no problem. Now, if we change the perspective from this microeconomic perspective to the macroeconomic perspective, then we will see that this equation does no longer necessarily hold for the macroeconomic aggregates. So let's consider now what happens if all households of an economy at the same time want to save more, and for this purpose reduce their expenditures. So all households reduce their expenditures, that means they demand less goods. We will see in practice, in reality, it's very often the case that if consumption of households goes down, firms adjust their production to this lower household consumption demand, to their lower expenditures. But then these firms need less production factors, especially less workers. So they will dismiss workers, or workers' income will fall for other reasons, such that now the income aggregate, the macroeconomic income aggregate, is very likely to fall. And if it falls by the same degree as expenditure, then in this case savings would simply stay constant. So what households have expected does not happen, because something unintended happens, in this case namely income falls. We will see this is exactly the case in the Keynesian economy, which we will discuss in chapter 4. Now, this is just one example that shows us that we cannot rely on the straightforward idea that macroeconomics is nothing else but adding up microeconomic results. That will very often not work. Now, let's go on with a quite simple way to describe all macroeconomic activities within an economy, the so-called circular flow model. Circular flow model is a basic concept that appears in all macroeconomic models, those which we will discuss later, like the neoclassical macroeconomic model and the Keynesian macroeconomic model. It is also the backbone of macroeconomic statistics, called national accounting. It is based on the idea that the economic exchange of goods and production factors between households and firms can be described as a circuit. The inventor of the macroeconomic circular flow model was the French medic François Quesnay, who lived in the 18th century and who took the idea from the discovery of the blood circuit in the 17th century. So François Quesnay was a kind of interdisciplinary thinker. He applied the circular flow model to the macroeconomy of his times. So he had three sectors. One sector had been the farmers, the other sector had been the artisans, and the third sector had been the class of nobility, who in those times owned a very important production factor, namely the land necessary for production. If we apply now this circular flow model to our times in a quite simple and basic way, we should, I think, distinguish two sectors as a starter. So one sector is the firm sector, the company sector, where all the production in the economy takes place. The other sector is the household sector. The households own all the production factors, especially they offer labor services on the labor market, they offer their savings on the capital market, and they offer also land and natural resources which they possess. Now, firms use the production factors which come from households to produce goods, to start with this, and then these goods are supplied to the markets for goods. On these markets, households appear on the demand side, so households demand these goods, and as an exchange, they pay the companies with money for the provision of these goods. Now, since households own all the production factors, they supply now on the factor markets of the economy these production factors to the company sector. Firms now appear on the demand side of the factor markets. They demand these production factors, especially labor and the savings of households, and then they pay households for labor and their savings with money, wages, interest rates, dividend, and the like. And now, as we see, this is indeed a circle. We have production factors flowing from household to firms. We have the goods produced by firms flowing from firms to households. And we see that there's also a kind of second circle, namely the flow of money from households to firms and back to households. Now, the circular flow model has two versions. In this first version, let's assume that all the prices are completely flexible. This is what we would call the neoclassical version. The idea that all prices are completely flexible is a neoclassical idea. That's a school of thought which we will discuss in chapter 2. So, prices are flexible, which means prices can adjust in a way to balance markets. For example, if there's a market for goods where demand of household is especially strong, such that we have excess demand for a short moment, then prices will immediately adjust, prices will grow, so firms will have an incentive to produce and supply more, while at the same time less households will demand the same good if prices are higher. So prices take care that markets are always balanced. This is a very nice idea. It's also the same idea, the same assumptions that is typically used in macroeconomics. However, it does not actually fit with the actual behavior on real world markets. There, we very often observe that prices are not flexible, that they are relatively constant over a certain span of time. And instead, firms do not adjust prices, but they adjust their production quantities. So if demand grows, firms happily produce more because that helps them to make more profits. And if demand falls, firms produce less because they want to sell all their production. We will see in chapter 4 why this makes actually sense. It's compatible with rational behavior, even with profit maximization behavior. So, therefore, we have also a second version of the circular flow model, and this version is called the Keynesian version. In the Keynesian version, not prices are flexible, but in the Keynesian version, quantities are flexible. Prices are instead rigid. This is the basic assumption John Maynard Keynes had made to describe the macroeconomic economy, and therefore we will discuss this assumption and this version of the circular flow model in chapter 4, where we will introduce the ideas of John Maynard Keynes and his macroeconomic theory. So we have two versions of the circular flow model, neoclassical and the Keynesian version. Both versions of the circular flow model are of course quite simplified. So here we've made the simplifying assumptions that only households and firms exist. Under these simplifying assumptions, if we would add up the production value of all firms, we would receive the gross domestic product of this economy. However, in reality, not only households and firms, but also government and especially foreign countries exist. To make the calculation of GDP more realistic, we have to take care for these sectors too. And how this is done is shown in the next section. Here we will discuss what GDP is, how GDP, gross domestic product, is defined, and also discuss a couple of problems we have in calculating GDP. So let's start with the official definition of gross domestic product. It's the market value of all final products produced within a country in a given period of time. Now let me give you some comments on this definition. There are a couple of words used to define GDP which need themselves a kind of definition. What, for example, means market value? The problem is you cannot compare apples and oranges, so it would make not much sense to add up apples and oranges and say we have 50 kilogram apples and oranges here. That's an aggregate that does not make much sense, and the same applies, let's say, to cars and refrigerators. 1,700 cars and refrigerators is not an aggregate that makes much sense. Consequently, we need a measure that makes different kind of products comparable. And therefore, the market price of each product is taken and multiplied by the quantity of each product. So this makes sense because the market price contains the information what value a product has in the eyes of the producers and consumers. Hence, the market price can be in fact taken to evaluate a product. So that is the first point I would like to make. The next point is, what means products? Well, very important. GDP measures not only tangible products or hardware, it measures also intangible products, especially so-called services. What are services? Well, the unofficial definition is services are those products that cannot drop on your feet. Examples for services are haircuts, management consultancy, music concerts, food care, medical treatment, insurance, home help, bank transfer, building design, and so on. So I think you all have an intuitive understanding what services are. It's very important because most economies today do not primarily produce tangible products, hardware or industrial products, but the largest part of GDP is service sector production. That's something we will see later when we have a closer look how GDP of Germany is composed. So this is an important point. GDP takes also care for the production of services. Okay, now in the definition of GDP we have used the expression all final products. What does that mean? Why do we use the adjective final here? Final means that we have to take care to calculate only the actual production of a company and not intermediate production this company has received from other firms. So we have to deal here with the problem which is called multiple counting of intermediate inputs. To make a simple example, let's assume the production of car tires. So car tires are produced by a car tire producer. Let's assume car tire producer produces tires and sells these tires to a car producer. This would be a market transaction. If you would add up the sales of the car tire producer, we would count the value of these car tires for the first time. Now, the car producer typically attaches the tire to a car and then sells this car to a car dealer. Now, if we would also add the value of this car to GDP, we would account for these car tires for a second time. If this car dealer now sells the car to final consumer and we would add the sales of this car dealer to GDP, then we would account for the value of this car tire a third time. So if we simply add up the sales of these three economic agents, the tire producer, the car producer and the car dealer, the value of the car tire would be added 3 times to GDP, which would of course make no sense. How can we solve this problem? Well, there's a quite simple and straightforward solution. We take the sales of every firm and subtract from these sales the intermediate input this firm has received from other firms. The value we then receive is the gross value added by this firm. This value added of the firm is the contribution of this firm to GDP. This is the standard procedure how GDP is measured. Roughly 80% of German GDP is measured this way. However, there are many economic activities where the measurement of GDP is much more difficult. These are discussed in the following. First problem deals with home production. So, official definition of GDP tells us that we should measure all final products, but home production is one area where we have difficulties in accounting for all final products. To understand the problem, consider a situation where you prepare a meal in your apartment. The value added created by your work does of course not enter GDP. If you would buy this meal in a restaurant, however, the value added created by the cook of this restaurant would enter GDP. The problem this example reveals is that statistical offices are informed about the sales of a restaurant and also the purchase of intermediate products by this restaurant, so they can calculate the value added of the production of this restaurant. But of course, statistical offices are not informed about the production that takes place in your apartment at home, because this production is not sold over market. So we have no market transactions. Statistical offices can only measure market transactions. This is the problem, and you may argue that it's perhaps not that important, this home production that takes place in your apartment when you prepare a meal or when you, for example, tidy your room. This is neglectable. Maybe this is an argument. The problem is, however, there are countries where home production plays a much more important role as in typical developed countries. These countries are what we call developing countries, and developing countries have mostly a very large sector of subsistence farming. Here, a large part of production is production of food by small farms for their own consumption. That's what we call subsistence farming. Since this production is consumed without a market transaction, in the same way as you consume the meal which you prepare in your apartment, it does not enter measured GDP. Consequently, an important part of total GDP in these developing countries is not accounted for. So here we have a real big information gap. The actual GDP in developing countries is typically significantly larger than the GDP as measured by statistical offices. This is something we have to take into consideration if we compare GDP of developing countries with the GDP of developed countries, where subsistence farming plays not such an important role. Another area where the coverage of gross value added is difficult is the shadow economy. Here, producers do not pay taxes or provide production data to statistical offices. Until recently, the Federal Statistical Office of Germany has estimated non-taxed value added creation in legal sectors only. Legal sectors with a substantial part of shadow economy are typically the construction sector or the handcraft sector. Starting with the year 2014, the German Statistical Office provides also estimates of the value added of illegal activities, such as drugs and smuggling. The following digression explains how this estimation is done. I think it's quite interesting. It's however not subject of the written examination, so it's just for information. It shows and makes quite clear that GDP is an amoral concept. So it measures what is produced within a country. Whether you may think it's good or bad plays no role. It's just value added created within a country according to the formula we have seen. A further area where the coverage of GDP is incomplete are services provided by governments, parties, political parties, trade unions, churches, and other non-profit organizations. These organizations provide the largest part of their services for free to their clients, which means without measurable payments. Hence, no market prices exist to evaluate their services. Therefore, statistical offices estimate the production value of non-profit organizations by, to the most part at least, their payroll costs. So the money they pay to their workers, in other words. Thereby, they assume that the value added of goods and services produced by the employees of these organizations equals the value of their wages and salaries. This is, of course, an assumption that can sometimes be criticized, but it's an approximation and one way how to estimate gross value added created in areas where the coverage is difficult. Okay, finally, there's one expression we still have to discuss. We used for the definition of GDP the expression production within a country. So what does within a country mean? Well, GDP measures only goods and services produced within a country, regardless by who. For example, if somebody from Strasbourg works in Freiburg, this is accounted for as German GDP, because this work takes place in Freiburg. If somebody from Freiburg works in Strasbourg, this is accounted for as French GDP, because the production of this worker takes place in Strasbourg. Therefore, the GDP concept is also called inland concept, contrary to the inhabitant concept on which the calculation of gross national product, GNP, is based. We will later define the difference between GDP and GNP. Okay, let me sum up what we have taken together today. First, definition of GDP, very important. Market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. Market value means we evaluate different production quantities of different kinds of goods or services with their market prices. We've seen that it is important to make an adjustment for intermediate inputs to prevent multiple counting. All final goods and services means that this is a little bit too optimistic, because we have in fact a couple of accounting problems. We have seen that we have a problem in accounting for home production. We have seen that we also have a problem in accounting for the gross value added of non-profit organizations. And we have seen that there are, of course, problems in accounting for the gross value added created by the shadow economy. We have discussed the various approaches statistical offices use to cope with these problems. Finally, we should keep in mind that GDP is only domestical production of goods and services. Now, if you are interested in statistical sources that provide you information about GDP, I can give you 3 links. The measurement of GDP is, as already mentioned, internationally standardized by the United Nations, and the Statistical Office of the United Nations has a database which you can reach via this link, and there you find GDP for all member states of the United Nations. So that is the broadest database for GDP. Within the European Union, more detailed sub-aggregates of GDP, which we will discuss in the next chapter, are available at the Statistical Office of the European Commission. The link to this database is this one. And then we have also additional information which even more detailed sub-aggregates by the Statistical Office of the European Union. And the link to this database is this one. So now we've reached the end of this lesson. The next lesson we will start with a discussion of 3 different ways that can be used to calculate GDP.